thank you very much for asking me here, Peter, and those who were responsible for that. The ostensible reason is indeed the book, and as you'll hear, the Economic and Social Research Institute here in Dublin played quite an important part in the research project on which the book is based, which was this research project called COMETR, looking particularly at the competitiveness effects of environmental tax reforms, and I shall give a definition of environmental tax reform in a minute, which finished in 2007, so it's reasonably current. I've been involved in two big projects on environmental taxes since then, the results of which are about to be launched this month. One is the Anglo-German Foundation project, looking, again, Europe-wide at a much larger environmental tax reform for Europe going out to 2020, and the other is the UK Green Fiscal Commission looking at these issues from a UK perspective. So there's quite a lot going on, and I'm busy using Ireland as an example to show that carbon energy taxation is not dead as a political concept, because I understand that you're about to introduce one along with the French. And these are two really important developments, especially as the French proposal is to use an annual escalator to go from the 17 euros per tonne of carbon dioxide, which they'll introduce their carbon tax at, up to about 100 euros per tonne of carbon dioxide in 2030. And at that kind of level, we might start to see the sorts of levels of low-carbon investment that we need if we're to make a significant impact on the climate issue. Well, those were the COMETR partners, as you can see. I won't go through them. I was at the Policy Studies Institute at the time that the project took place, so that's why I'm here. But you can see that ESRI in Dublin and both John Fitz Gerald and Sue Scott did some important work, which I'll talk about briefly, but only briefly. It was a pretty intensive project, and we covered a range of methods of research techniques, and I can't possibly cover all of them. So I'm only going to talk about the three that have got an asterisk in front of them. If you have any questions about the others, I'll do what I can to answer them. But of course, there are chapters on each of these approaches in the book, and I think I can safely say that it is easily the most comprehensive analysis, not just of competitiveness effects of ETR, but really competitiveness effects of any kind of environmental policy, because we really went into some detail as to what this concept of competitiveness means. And I'm going to start with that, because although everybody thinks they know what competitiveness means, and this is an absolutely standard topic of debate in discussions about this and many other things, actually, once you get into what competitiveness means, it's by no means straightforward. That is the definition of ETRs that was in the Delors White Paper all the way back in 1993, which those of you who are as old as I am, I've no doubt will remember, that it is a tax shift, essentially, between taxes, taking taxes off labour and profits and putting them onto pollution and resource use. I'll talk about differences in tax rates between European countries. We spent quite a lot of time working those out because it's by no means straightforward. The sectoral results, which are the work that ESRI contributed to. Macroeconomic modelling, which was quite important, and I don't think had been done before in the way that we did it, and then a few conclusions. So definitions of competitiveness. The first thing that's absolutely essential is to be clear whether you're talking about firms or sectors or countries, and what competitiveness might mean for each of those three entities or sets of entities is actually quite different. The firm, it's pretty obvious, it's competitive if it stays in business and manages to expand. Sectors, well, a bit different, because sectors consist of many firms, and the one thing that any kind of sectoral analysis at the firm level discovers is that some firms are more competitive than others and respond better or worse to regulation than others. And then in countries, competitiveness of a country, I remember the Irishman who worked at the UK Treasury for a long time and sadly died a year or two back, Norman Glass, used to say that talking of the competitiveness of a country was complete nonsense, because what would happen was that exchange rates would simply adjust and the country would go on as before. But I mean, actually, we kind of think of it, if we look at those definitions, if a country can increase its standard of living, if it can engage in international markets and sell goods abroad, then broadly you might think of it as competitive. Very interestingly, as we came to think about this, with that kind of definition, obviously a competitive country is one in which the real wage is rising, but as we know, labour costs are a major input cost into production. So in a sense, where the real wage is rising, you're undermining your own competitiveness because your input costs are rising. So you've got this kind of little paradox about what competitiveness is. Well, if that's what competitiveness kind of is at different levels, and we tried to study it at different levels, as you'll see, what is ETR, this tax shift? And I stress the tax shift. It means taking taxes off some things as well as putting taxes on some things. What is that going to do to competitiveness? Well, again, this is not a straightforward matter. Obviously, if all you were doing was sticking on extra taxes onto businesses, you would expect competitiveness to be negatively affected. But that's not all that we're doing, because I've said that we're reducing other taxes. So where those other taxes are reductions in taxes on business, that's also going to have a positive effect on their competitiveness. And then if you're taking off labour taxes, you might increase employment and output, which might add to the aggregate demand of the economy, and that's also going to have an impact on competitiveness. And of course, if energy taxes go up and energy prices go up, you would expect rational firms to invest more in energy efficiency so that they use less energy. And there's quite a lot of evidence that there's a lot of cost-effective opportunities for energy efficiency which are not utilised, even by relatively efficient firms. And obviously, to the extent they do that, that will reduce the competitiveness impact. Then, if you're managing to improve environmental quality, and this doesn't, of course, apply to a global pollutant like carbon dioxide, but it could be important for local pollutants, you might expect to create more attractive places to live, which can also increase your competitiveness. And then you've got the final issue about the stimulation of environmental industries. When we were doing this work, this was less apparent. The empirical evidence for this was less apparent than it is now, but when you think that Denmark now exports more wind turbines than it does agricultural products, and that was previously its largest export sector, you can see that it's possible through the fostering of low-carbon industries to build up new competitive advantages. So all those issues are important in thinking about the overall effects on competitiveness of this particular policy. And as you'd expect, given so many kinds of nuances and factors that influence this concept, there are many different ways in which one might seek to measure competitiveness. None of them is definitive, and we tried to look at a whole range of them in the course of this project, and obviously that's described in the book. Well, ETRs have actually been implemented in 6 North European countries, not Ireland as yet, and I don't know whether the proposals are for your carbon tax to be an ETR or not. I suspect not, given the levels of public deficits in most countries at the moment. But in the 1990s and early 2000s, there were 6 significant ETRs in the countries listed. They were all designed differently, but they all had, if we jump to the bottom bullet point, they all had the common political objectives of both improving the environment, and I stress that that is always the principal objective of this policy. Any attempt to think that you can kind of, you're introducing this in order to increase the overall efficiency of the economy per se is likely to be misguided. But if you want to improve the environment, then this may be a very cost-effective way of doing it, because a lot of the models suggest that you will get increased employment. And at a time when there's considerable unemployment, that's a not insignificant factor. So, I've now got, in case anyone wanted these slides, I've now got 6 slides of what these environmental tax reforms were, which obviously I don't have time to run through in any detail, but if you want to look at them, that's a quick summary. So there's Denmark, Finland, Germany, Netherlands, Sweden, and the UK. Okay, so that's just there, very quick snapshots of what those ETRs were in those 6 countries. One of the things that was most surprising, I mean, we're in a kind of common market situation in the European Union. You might have thought that a globally traded commodity like oil, gas and coal, that there would be some kind of pre-tax price equalization across the EU. But in fact, that is not the case at all. Obviously, there are exchange rate issues. Energy import prices vary by country. There's different levels of tarification, which means the conversion of fossil fuel prices into electricity prices. And then, obviously, different energy tax rates and the ways in which they've evolved. And I've just got a few little pictures which I think are quite illustrative. These are the nominal energy tax rates on natural gas in what we call the ETR countries. So you'll see the six ETR countries. That was the headline rate. But after the business associations negotiated and lobbied the government on businesses, those rates fell to that. This again is very interesting, and you can see how that happened. You can see Sweden right at the beginning was obviously had a lot of real straight economists there who thought that business ought to pay the same as everybody else, but they were brought into line fairly quickly by the power of the business community. Very similar kind of picture there to in electricity. Again, you can see high rates in Denmark in particular, and then as the business these issues of competitiveness became important, they fell. So one of the reasons why we discovered that actually there had been practically no impacts on competitiveness from these ETRs is that actually there were these very heavy exemptions for energy-intensive industries. And the way these exemptions were designed was very different in different countries, and you need to look at the detail of it, but you can see that the overall tax rate on those industries is not high. And then, obviously, for sectors, there's another whole host of issues that might affect whether or not they're going to be affected by competitiveness. The tax rates themselves are obviously important, but just as important is the carbon or energy intensity of the product. If it's not very carbon energy intensive, you can imagine that they won't be much affected. Similarly, the trade intensity. Are they internationally traded? And a very energy-intensive product like cement, for example, is not heavily internationally traded, and so you wouldn't expect the competitiveness effects on the cement sector to be so large. And then this analysis as to whether these sectors have any power in international markets to set their prices. And that particularly was the analysis that was done by John and Sue at ESRI, and that was kind of their headline result, which I think was a kind of very important result because it was a very, obviously, graphic illustration, and this was the result of some fairly sophisticated econometrics, such that you've got foreign price influence decreasing along the top, and you've got energy expenditure shares increasing up the vertical axis, and so you can see that where you have a high energy expenditure share, and you have little influence on foreign prices. In other words, that top left-hand corner, you're going to be more vulnerable. So basic metals and chemicals have the most cause for concern, whereas the food, beverages and tobacco and non-metallic mineral products. So there is cement. So although cement, very energy intensive, actually not terribly vulnerable because the foreign price doesn't have a great deal of influence. This was another piece of econometric analysis that was done by Keeney in Denmark and looked at, as you can see, 56 industry sectors, including some of the most energy-intensive ones, and tried to see to what extent changes in energy prices and energy taxes led to increases in unit energy costs. And you can see that, obviously, because the energy tax is a relatively small proportion of the price, even at the levels that they were implemented, it led to a very small increase in the unit energy costs. I'm skipping through these at some speed because I'm aware that we need to have time for discussion. So these were our conclusions on sectoral competitiveness. Energy and electricity taxes determine a relatively small part of the prices of energy for businesses, and we saw why that was the case. That country variations are very large, that industrial energy taxes are a small proportion of the nominal headline rates. We wondered whether it was possible to see a particular country. I mean, normally what one analyst like me kind of suspect is that our country is the worst in the world and that there's some country out there that is really brilliant. But actually, there wasn't a clear leader among any of these 6 North European countries in terms of energy efficiency. But we also didn't see really any real impact on this competitiveness, and came to the conclusion by the end of the project that actually the enormous bureaucratic effort that had gone into designing these exemptions had probably been misplaced because that was a very large cost. And there's a slide that will come up that shows the impact of that on environmental effectiveness. Very quickly then, to move on to the last of the areas that I'm going to talk about, which is the macroeconomic modelling of these ETRs. This is a model run by Cambridge Econometrics, E3ME, now EU27, was EU25 when we did the work. A very interesting mix of ex ante and ex post analysis. We took a data set from 1994 to 2012. From 1994 to 2003, we actually had the data of what had happened in energy, environment, economy variables. From 2003 to 2012, obviously, we were projecting forward. We had 2 scenarios. The baseline scenario, which is their normal run, I mean, this is what happened with all the ETRs, all the taxes and the tax reductions in place. And then the counterfactual, where those taxes were taken off, or the ETR, the environmental tax reform, was unimplemented, and then run a counterfactual against that, and then compared. So all the slides I'm now going to show very quickly are comparisons between this reference case with the counterfactual where there was no ETR, that's what might have happened if the ETR hadn't been introduced, and the baseline, which is what actually happened. So, total fuel demand, no real surprises there. Energy price goes up, fuel goes down. These are econometric models, so they obviously are built on real data and looking at the relationships between the variables on the basis of what's actually happened. And Slovenia was put in there, to be honest, I'm not quite sure why, but someone said that Slovenia had kind of partially implemented an ETR, and we were interested to have a new member state, as Slovenia was a new member state in those days. But you'll see from all these diagrams that the impact of anything on Slovenia was very small. So it's a bit surplus to requirements in a way. But so this is effect on greenhouse gas emissions, and very similar to energy demand. But if you just look at the scales, you'll see that there is actually a slightly larger percentage reduction in many other countries in greenhouse gas emissions, to the effect that where the implementation was of carbon tax, the carbon reductions were higher than the energy reductions, as you would hope from your economic theory. Effects of ETR on GDP. Well, the first thing to say about that slide is that it's very small. Out to 2012, you can see you're talking about a 0.5% difference, which is hardly worth worrying about. And the way I always interpret a picture like that is that it's not negative. The important thing about that is that ETR is not having a negative impact on the economy. Interesting with Finland, that effect, that outlier effect, is because Finland was importing a lot of energy, and the reduction in fuel demand meant that it was importing less, and therefore it had this GDP effect. Similarly, the effect on employment, also pretty small. Not by any means negligible in terms of thousands of jobs, but again, you're not... I think the headline message is that it's not negative. Consumer price index. Critically, of course, this depends how this is modelled. You expect a little bit of inflation if you're increasing energy taxes, of course, because that's in the basket on which the CPI is calculated. If you're reducing labour taxes, what does that do to inflation? And you have to, will that cause firms to reduce the price of their products if their wages go down? It might not, depends on how the labour market is being modelled within there. Sweden has a relatively high effect because the overwhelming ETR in Sweden was on households, and that, of course, fed straight into the consumer price index, whereas the others, there was a much higher proportion on business, and therefore the effect on consumer price index is less straightforward. That's a very important picture because it addresses this phenomenon called carbon leakage. The argument that you often get is that if some countries do it and other countries don't, then industry will shift and trade will shift, and what will happen is that emissions will go up, GDP and emissions will go up in the countries that don't do it. Well, you can see the impact on the non-ETR countries of the European Union was very, very small. There's that small GDP increase that we saw in the earlier slide, but this time aggregated across the 6 countries. And that was the effect of the exemptions, these industrial exemptions that I showed you right at the beginning. If, in the case of Denmark, you can see that you lost really quite a lot of the benefit environmentally by exempting these relatively few sectors. Remember, we're only talking about exempting the energy-intensive sectors. So, almost at the end. And this is the conclusions on the modelling of these ETRs. Fuel use and greenhouse gas emissions fall. That's what they're expected to do, and they do it. And they fall significantly, 5 to 6% for these relatively small tax shifts. These were only 1.25% of GDP at a maximum, so this was not a large tax shift. We've got small increases in GDP and employment, and for most countries, very modest increases in the consumer price index, which leads me very much to conclude that this is a pretty good policy instrument for countries that want to reduce carbon emissions, as all countries now say they do, because you're getting significant carbon emission reductions with very, very small economic impacts indeed. Of course, you might say, well, this is only small ETR, what about large ETRs? And I shall have to ask you to wait for the next instalment of that from the 2 projects that I mentioned right at the beginning, because we looked forward to 2020. We implemented for Europe, and this is the Anglo-German Foundation project, an ETR that meets the EU carbon reduction targets. That's a 20% reduction by 2020 and a 30% reduction with international cooperation. And we met those targets just with an ETR, and very similar kind of economic results to what I've just shown you. And then we did it for the UK with obviously a UK model. In this case, we didn't impose the carbon reduction. What we said was, what happens if we increase the proportion of environmental taxation revenues in total taxation revenues from their current level of about 7% to between 15 and 20%. In other words, you increase them by between a factor of 2 and 3. What kind of impact will that have both on greenhouse gas emissions and on the economy? And both those reports of those projects are going to be published later this month, so watch this space. Thanks very much.
Very good. Thank you very much.